There still isn't a lot of information out there about Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, the next game from the creators of Dark Souls, but there are some little tidbits that we do know that we want to break down for you. Today in gameranx, here's everything you need to know about Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Starting off at number 10, I think when this game was first shown off, everyone had an idea of how the game was going to play. I think most of us expected it to play a lot like a Dark Souls or Bloodborne. It turns out that this really isn't the case at all. It isn't an RPG like the last few From Software games, but it is instead an action-adventure game. There are no classes, no stats to dump points into, and you won't collect any other weapons or armor either. So everyone is going to be playing as the same exact character with the same exact weapons and armor and the same exact moveset, which is a lot different than a Dark Souls game, where there are so many different ways to run through the game class-wise. In an interview with series creator and director Hidetaka Miyazaki, he said that Sekiro was not designed as an evolution of Soulsborne of the Souls series. It was designed from the ground up, from scratch, as an entirely new concept, as a new game. So we don't know if you'd still call this an evolution of the series in this sense. He goes on to say that they don't want to disappoint or turn away fans of the Souls games, and that Sekiro will still be challenging, which is good, because I can't imagine playing a From Software game that isn't difficult. Moving on to number 9, in an interview with GameSpot, when asked about whether or not Sekiro would have some form of multiplayer, a From Software developer said this title is designed from the beginning to be a single-player experience. Dark Souls and Bloodborne has always had some type of multiplayer mechanics. They had co-op, they also had PvP in the form of players being able to invade other players' games, either to help them out or to ruin their fun time. This is an interesting move for sure, seeing that all of their other games are pretty single-player centric, even with the multiplayer components. So I guess removing the multiplayer leaves time and room for them to really double down on this being a single player experience. Before its announcement, there was a leak that suggested that Sekiro would have PvP and that players were going to be able to invade another player's world, but not as themselves, but as a monster, which does sound pretty cool, but this interview pretty much squashes that rumor, as cool as that probably would have been. I'm not huge into the Dark Souls and Bloodborne PvP, so this really doesn't affect me, but I know that a lot of people are really into this, and there are a lot of character builds that are geared solely towards PvP, so this may not be good news for some people, and I totally get it. Next up, at number 8, there are a few things that really set Sekiro apart from Dark Souls and Bloodborne, and while the lack of RPG mechanics and different classes might seem like pretty big omissions, what's even bigger and more weird is the fact that there are no bonfires or souls, and these are staples of the Souls games. Even Bloodborne had them in its own different way, so like for a From Software game to not have them is just kind of weird. Not that From Software is only allowed to make Souls-like games, I'm just used to that kind of game from them. Like the bonfires, the pushing the door open animation, stuff like that. It's kind of like the calling card of From Software. They just have to do that to make it a From Software game. But I'm actually really excited to see what else they have to offer, what else they're able to produce. Sekiro seems more like your traditional Zelda-esque action-adventure game, and I can't wait to see how From Software tackles a game like that. Moving on to number 7, so I mentioned earlier that you'll be using the same katana for the entire game. While you do use the same weapon, your arm is actually upgradable, and you'll come across different upgrades that are offensive and defensive. For one, you can get an axe upgrade that can be used to break through shields, and a torch that you can use to light enemies on fire. There's also a shield add-on that you can use to block damage. So while you may be using the same weapon the entire game, there are gadgets and arm upgrades that you can use to kind of change up the combat a little bit and how you play. It's an interesting way to keep the combat from getting stale, because using the same weapon the entire game could definitely get a little bit boring, but I think the addition of gadgets and arm upgrades is a cool little touch. Coming in at number 6, while we're on the topic of gadgets and add-ons, let's take a second to talk about the grappling hook that was showcased in the reveal trailer. Obviously, this was a big deal. In Dark Souls and Bloodborne, you're always grounded and walking through tight hallways where you can barely swing your weapon without it banging against a wall. But here in Sekiro, you're able to use your grappling hook to jump onto a roof, a cliff, across a ravine, etc., etc. It can be used to find optimal ways through a level, as well as being something you're able to use in combat. So it isn't just a tool used for traversal, it's also a great tool when it comes to stealth, which brings us to our next point at number 5. Sekiro actually has stealth mechanics, and not like Dark Souls where you just try to bait enemies away from a group to fight them one-on-one. It has real stealth mechanics. You could use your grappling hook to get onto the roof of a building to either sneak past enemies or avoid them altogether, or just sneak up behind them to use your shinobi death blow, which could actually kill a lower level enemy in one shot. Certain enemies you encounter might be way too powerful for you to take on, so sneaking past them might be the only option you have. Seeing that you're playing as a ninja or shinobi, it makes sense that there would be actual stealth mechanics, and I think it's pretty cool and an interesting add-on, seeing that we've never really had that in other From Software games. There's also a dedicated jump button, so traversing the environment is something that's going to be super important. And then number 4, this is pretty obvious, but the game takes place in 1500s Japan, and you're playing as a still unnamed shinobi, and it's your job to protect someone who seems to be pretty important. You get attacked by a powerful samurai who snatches away who you're protecting, he cuts off your arm, and he leaves you for dead. That's really all we know so far. We don't know much more. Japan is a bit reimagined, just like how Dark Souls is like a spooky reimagining of a medieval setting. And just like Dark Souls and Bloodborne, the world you'll be running around in is fairly large, and it's all interconnected. From Software's level design has always been super impressive, and with this new grappling hook and maneuverability, I'm curious to see how this map works. Dark Souls, their maps always came across as like mazes almost, and you'd find yourself back in an area that you didn't think you'd find yourself in again. And I think it's safe to assume that we'll be getting something similar to that, except a bit more layered this time around, seeing that you're not grounded the entire game. Moving on to number 3, Sekiro will feature some sort of resurrection mechanic. I mean, it's right in the title, shadows die twice. But we still really don't know too much about it other than the fact that it exists, and it has some people a little bit worried. Seeing that Dark Souls and Bloodborne are fairly difficult games, obviously you know that, and obviously you know that that's why a lot of people like them. And when you die in those games, you're sent back to your last checkpoint or bonfire or lantern. Sekiro doesn't seem to do this. Instead, at least based off of the trailer, when you die, you can resurrect yourself immediately right where you fell. Players are scared that this might make the game a little too easy, but the developers have stated more than once now that this isn't the case. They're saying that it won't take away from the tension of the game. Hopefully, once it gets closer to release, we'll know more about how exactly this resurrection mechanic works. And coming in at number 2, combat is going to be a little bit different this time around as well. It's definitely closer to Bloodborne's in the sense of it's more fast-paced. You have your katana that you'll always have in your right hand, and then your upgradable arm on your left. That will be different depending on how many upgrades you have, which we did mention earlier in this video. The character you play as is pretty agile, so combat is just naturally faster. Also, your stamina bar isn't the only bar you'll be worrying about. There's a posture bar now that will go down every time you block an attack from an enemy. Enemies also have this posture bar, and when you deplete it, you'll be able to perform a shinobi death blow to do a big chunk of damage. Enemies can do the same exact thing to you as well, so you have one more thing to worry about during combat. You also have your grappling hook that you're able to use during combat, so if you're really getting your ass beat, you're able to retreat to a tree or a rooftop to escape the fight to heal or just gather yourself before heading back down into battle. There's also human enemies, which is kind of weird because in their past games, we were always fighting like undead monsters and stuff like that, so there are little subtle changes that are gonna be made to the combat. Finally, at number 1, a lot of this new information we've been getting about Sekiro might have you thinking that it might be too easy compared to Dark Souls and Bloodborne, but according to From Software, Sekiro is even more difficult than their previous titles. They really didn't give any specific details as to what is going to make it more challenging, but I guess we'll just have to take their word for it and wait and see. The game's director did go on to say that the game should appeal to a pretty broad audience. If you're into just running in and taking out as many enemies at once, you can do that, but it's going to feel pretty intense. But if you'd rather take the more Dark Souls approach where you make your way through the game a little slower, taking on one enemy at a time, learning their weaknesses, you can do that as well. In the same interview, he went on to say that Sekiro is not part of the Dark Souls and Bloodborne series and that it's its own separate thing. And that's everything you need to know about Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, but we want to hear from you, so meet us down in the comments below and let us know what you think. Are you excited to get your hands on this game, and how do you feel about that resurrection mechanic? Do you think it might make the game too easy? And as I'm sure you already know, hitting the like button really helps us out, and if you're new here, subscribing is a really good idea because we put up videos like this every single day. As always, thank you for stopping by to hang out with us. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.